He smiled for the cameras. Just hours after losing 3 fingers in a studio explosion, another was Hollywood's king, but couldn't eat without pain. Now, we're uncovering 18 stories the studios buried, and the truths even co-stars never knew. Harold Lloyd, a missing hand hidden in plain sight. In 1923, Harold Lloyd dangled from a clock tower 10 stories above the street, using only one real hand. Audiences watching Safety Last saw a fearless daredevil, a man whose grip on the ledge seemed stronger than gravity itself. What they didn't know was that Lloyd had already lost his thumb and index finger 4 years earlier in a freak accident involving a prop bomb. The explosion nearly blinded him and shattered his right hand. At the time, newspapers were told he'd made a full recovery, but that wasn't true. He returned to the screen wearing a flesh-colored prosthetic glove designed to hide his missing fingers. It was stiff, sweaty, and painful. The rubber prosthesis limited his grip and left his hand numb during long shoots. Every time he scaled a building or clutched a moving vehicle, he was essentially doing it with 1.5 functional hands. Each stunt was a negotiation with death. Lloyd refused to let the studios shelve him. Executives quietly suggested he move into directing, but he saw that as a slow fade to irrelevance. So instead, he doubled down, choreographing stunts more dangerous than before, determined to prove he was still bankable, still whole. The result? Breathtaking sequences that left audiences gasping, unaware that one slip could have ended it all. Behind the scenes, the pressure was suffocating. Insurance companies refused to cover disabled performers. If his secret got out, his career and income could vanish overnight. His contracts even included clauses forbidding photographers from capturing his hand without the glove. He became a master of misdirection, using clever blocking, body doubles, and costume design to protect the illusion. But illusions have weight. The glove chafed his skin raw. His hand would swell during shooting days, and infections became a constant risk. Yet he never complained, because the truth was simple. If Harold Lloyd stopped climbing, he'd start falling. In the public eye, in the eyes of studio heads, and perhaps in his own. His fans saw a fearless hero. What they didn't see was a man clinging to every ledge not just for the scene, but for his right to be seen at all. Clark Gable, Hollywood's king with no real teeth. They called him the King of Hollywood. But behind that famous smile was a mouthful of pain he never wanted the world to see. He was the leading man, with his rugged jawline, slick hair, and devil-may-care charm. He captivated audiences from It Happened One Night to Gone with the Wind. But by the time he was in his early 30s, Gable had lost every one of his natural teeth. Years of neglected dental health and severe gum disease left him with a raw, aching mouth and a daily routine of painkillers and denture adhesives. Studios rushed him through a full extraction and fitted him with a set of dentures, but they never fit quite right. They caused constant ulcers, nerve pain, and even low-grade fevers from infection. Yet no one on screen ever saw him flinch, because flinching wasn't allowed. His co-stars did, though. Vivian Leigh once wrote that kissing Gable was like pressing your lips against a stovetop. Joan Crawford reportedly dabbed peppermint oil inside her nostrils before romantic scenes just to tolerate the smell of his chronic halitosis, a side effect of the ulcers and infection festering beneath the porcelain. Technicians were forced to rework entire scenes due to the slight whistle his dentures created during dialogue. Directors began filming close-ups using stand-ins, matching clothing and posture so the illusion of intimacy remained intact, even if Gable wasn't in the frame. But nothing cut deeper than the effect it had on Gable himself. He grew deeply self-conscious. He stopped eating in public. He often covered his mouth when laughing, and at night, the so-called king would soak his teeth in a glass on the bathroom counter, terrified anyone might see. The man who made women across America swoon spent much of his private life in quiet embarrassment, afraid his secret would strip him of the masculine image the studio had so carefully sculpted. Clark Gable may have been the king on screen, but behind the scenes, he lived in fear of a smile that wasn't truly his. And Hollywood, ever obsessed with perfection, let the illusion reign, even as the man behind it crumbled. James Stewart, the limp, the studio denied. In 1945, Jimmy Stewart stepped off a B-24 bomber plane, a hero, but Hollywood only saw the limp. The war had changed him. He'd flown 20 combat missions over Nazi-occupied Europe, narrowly surviving flak-filled skies that tore through his squadron like paper. By the time he returned, Stewart was thinner, quieter, and walked with a subtle drag in his right leg, a remnant of nerve damage sustained during his service. His once boyish stride, so familiar in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and the Philadelphia Story, had been replaced by a guarded stiffness. Hollywood didn't want to see it. MGM executives panicked. Their leading man, America's golden boy, could no longer walk the way the scripts demanded. His agent was told flatly, "We can't market damaged goods." The limp became taboo. Forbidden in public, forbidden on camera. Directors were ordered to shoot Stewart from the waist up or choreograph scenes so he was always seated, leaning or moving slowly through shadow. Behind the scenes, he was forced into painful physical therapy regimens, not to heal, but to mask. Trainers drilled him relentlessly between takes, trying to retrain his stride into something palatable. It was never discussed openly. The war was to be his glory, not his scar. One studio executive allegedly told a young assistant, "The American public can handle a soldier. They just can't handle a wounded one." Stewart knew the stakes. He was one of the few actors who didn't just act patriotism, he lived it. But the cost of service lingered quietly in every scene. When he returned to the screen in It's a Wonderful Life, the weariness in his eyes wasn't performance. It was the kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones after seeing too much, losing too many, and being asked to smile anyway. That limp, barely noticeable to viewers, became a daily reminder of what Hollywood refused to accept, that even heroes break. In the end, Stewart's dignity outlasted the denial. But the fact that studios once tried to erase a war injury tells you everything about the era's obsession with illusion, and how even bravery had to be polished before it could be packaged. Judy Garland, built on broken bones. They called her a force of nature, but her body was breaking from the very beginning. By the time The Wizard of Oz lit up American theaters in 1939, Judy Garland was already in pain, not the kind that could be seen on her face, but the kind that pulsed deep in her hips and legs every time she moved. One of her legs was shorter than the other, a condition never disclosed to the public. To correct the visible imbalance, MGM ordered custom-made shoes with orthopedic inserts hidden inside the ruby slippers every step she took, as Dorothy came with a twinge of pain disguised by sequins and studio magic. But the shoes were only the beginning. As she grew, the pressure intensified. Studio doctors and handlers monitored her weight and appearance with punishing precision, often prescribing so-called vitamin injections to keep her slim and energized, a euphemism for substances that disrupted her natural growth and left her dependent on external control. Behind closed doors, trainers pushed her through rehearsals while she fought exhaustion, aching joints, and mood swings she didn't yet understand. The imbalance in her legs led to chronic back pain. But rest was a luxury Judy Garland couldn't afford. She was a contract star, owned by the studio. At just 16, she was making grown men cry on screen, while being treated like a malfunctioning product behind it. She was ridiculed for her posture, scolded for weight gain, and publicly humiliated in studio notes that referred to her as the fat one or not photogenic. They never mentioned her spine, or her hips, or the fact that she was trying to carry an entire industry on a frame that wasn't built to withstand that kind of pressure. And still, she danced. Still, she sang in perfect pitch, even when her legs trembled beneath her. Still, she smiled, a smile bright enough to light up a theater, even when her back was aching through every chorus. Judy Garland didn't just perform through pain, she was sculpted by it. And though the world adored her sparkle, it never saw the scaffolding that held her up, not until it was too late. Lon Chaney Jr., the man of 1,000 self-inflicted pains. He didn't just play monsters, he became them. One act of agony at a time. Lon Chaney Sr. was the undisputed master of transformation in silent cinema, a man who could twist his face, body, and soul into any creature the role demanded. But the horror wasn't always in the makeup, it was in the mirror. Behind his legendary roles in The Phantom of the Opera and The Hunchback of Notre Dame was a body slowly breaking under the weight of self-inflicted suffering. He was born to deaf parents, which made him fluent in silence. Every twitch of the brow, every tremble of the lip. It wasn't just performance, it was language. But when the scripts called for deformity, he went far beyond gesture. For the Hunchback, Chaney didn't wear a fake hump. He strapped a 70-pound metal and leather apparatus to his back that crushed his ribs and contorted his torso into grotesque shapes. The weight was so punishing that crew members had to pry it off between takes so he could breathe. He vomited blood. He collapsed behind the curtain, but still, he returned for the next shot. When asked why he refused a lighter setup, his answer was chilling. Quasimodo suffered. I must suffer too. For Phantom of the Opera, he inserted wires into his nostrils to pull them open unnaturally wide, used hooks in his cheeks to stretch his face, and painted chemicals around his eyes to create the illusion of a skull. He was often left temporarily blind from the burns. His transformation for London After Midnight involved wires so sharp and tight they pierced his gums and led to blood poisoning, a condition so severe he had to be hospitalized. But the studio told the press it was exhaustion. Chaney was praised for his realism, but no one asked what it cost. He kept pushing, kept distorting, kept twisting himself into nightmares, until his immune system collapsed. At just 47 years old, he succumbed to complications from pneumonia. But those who knew him believed it wasn't the illness that killed him. It was the slow violence of sacrifice. Lon Chaney didn't just create monsters. The pain he gave them became his own. And by the time audiences applauded, the man beneath the makeup had already begun to disappear. Barbara Payton, broken back, broken trust. She once graced the arms of Hollywood's leading men and died nearly unrecognizable, her spine shattered and her name forgotten. Barbara Payton had the kind of beauty that stopped traffic. Platinum curls, sharp wit, and a screen presence that lit up noir thrillers like Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye. But behind that glow was a woman already unraveling under the weight of broken promises and escalating pain. By the early 1950s, Barbara was earning $10,000 a week, a fortune for the time. But her private life spun faster than any studio could control. Turbulent affairs, public scandals, and a growing dependence on alcohol made her tabloid fodder. The headlines painted her as reckless. What they didn't show was the silent agony she carried in her body. Sometime in the mid-1950s, she allegedly fell down a flight of stairs in a seedy Los Angeles apartment building, a fall that fractured her back and left her in chronic pain for the rest of her life. Some accounts suggest the injury was even more severe, possibly crushing vertebrae and damaging nerves. But there were no hospital photos, no statements from studio doctors, just silence, because, by then, the studios had already washed their hands of her. They labeled her difficult, whispered she couldn't stay sober, and left her to navigate an unforgiving city with mounting medical bills and no roles to speak of. Her limp became more pronounced. Her posture collapsed in on itself. By the 1960s, she was living in flop houses, selling herself just to survive. And through it all, her back throbbed, a constant reminder of what had been taken and what would never return. She wrote a memoir in 1963, I Am Not Ashamed, where the pain bleeds through every page. She wasn't seeking sympathy. She was just trying to be heard before the lights went out completely. Barbara Payton died at 39 with only 55 cents in her bank account. But the true cost of her fall wasn't financial. It was the way an industry so quick to showcase her beauty became even quicker to abandon her when that beauty was marred by injury and scandal. Hollywood loved Barbara Payton's face, but never had the courage to stand by her spine. Merle Oberon, the actress with a disfigured face and hidden race. She was billed as exotic, mysterious, and flawless. But behind the glow of studio lights was a face scarred by both glass and shame. Merle Oberon's rise to fame in the 1930s was like something out of a dream. Cast as the haunting Kathy in Wuthering Heights, she became a symbol of fragile beauty and old Hollywood mystique. But the dream was stitched together with secrets, and each one came with a cost. In 1937, a near-fatal car crash shattered the left side of her face. Her cheekbone was crushed, facial nerves severed, half her face became paralyzed, and with it, her career nearly ended. But Oberon refused to disappear. Her husband at the time, cinematographer Lucien Ballard, invented a groundbreaking piece of lighting equipment, the Obi light, which cast soft, shadowless illumination directly onto her face. It blurred the scars, masked the paralysis, and became a standard in Hollywood film. But behind every close-up was a woman terrified of being seen too clearly. Crew members recalled how makeup artists would gently dab the side of her face between takes, because she couldn't feel when she was drooling. She never let the cameras catch it. She couldn't, because the scars were only part of what she was hiding. Merle was born in Bombay to an Anglo-Indian mother, but in the color-strict caste system of 1930s, Hollywood, being mixed race, could erase a career before it began. So, the studio rewrote her biography. They claimed she was born in Tasmania to a white British family, and Merle, coached and cornered, stuck to the story. Each morning began with layers of skin-whitening makeup, chemical treatments that left burns and rashes beneath the glamour. The pain was physical, but the shame ran deeper. When she returned to India years later to film, distant relatives came to see her. Joyful to reconnect, she told them she didn't know who they were, and they wept as she walked away, committed to a lie that had become her legacy. Merle Oberon was immortalized in black and white, because the full color of her truth was too dangerous for the times, and in hiding her face and her blood, she became both legend and ghost. Jean Tierney, colorblind beauty with a fading mind. She was called too beautiful to be real, but behind that flawless face was a woman who couldn't see the colors she wore, and later couldn't remember the lines she spoke. Jean Tierney was Hollywood's porcelain goddess. Her performance in Leave Her to Heaven was so haunting, it earned her an Oscar nomination. But few knew she was acting through a haze of invisible obstacles. Jean suffered from severe color blindness, unable to distinguish reds from greens, a seemingly small issue that became a daily minefield on set. Costume fittings turned into quiet humiliations. Designers would ask her how she liked the emerald gown or the crimson lipstick, and she'd nod politely, not knowing what they were talking about. To cope, she memorized outfits by fabric texture and hanger position, but the pressure to maintain her graceful image never allowed her to admit the truth. Then came the second blow. Her mental health began to collapse. Under the weight of intense studio control, a string of personal tragedies, and the unrelenting demand to perform, Tierney unraveled as she battled alleged depression and symptoms later tied to bipolar disorder. Studios labeled her difficult. Their solution? Quietly administer vitamin treatments, euphemisms for chemical cocktails designed to keep her energetic and compliant. But the effects were devastating. In 1953, she suffered a public breakdown. She was institutionalized and subjected to repeated electroshock therapy, a practice that left her with long-term memory damage. When she returned to acting, she could no longer memorize dialogue. Cue cards became her silent co-stars. She described the experience in her autobiography with quiet devastation. The face they knew was still there, but behind it, I was fading. Despite this, Tierney fought her way back. She remarried, raised a family, and made occasional screen appearances. But her Hollywood chapter never truly reopened. The industry that once polished her into a symbol of perfection had no place for someone who now needed gentleness and grace over speed and sparkle. Jean Tierney's tragedy wasn't what you could see. It was what she carried silently, through scenes lit just right, in dresses she couldn't name, mouthing lines she no longer remembered, and yet she still moved with elegance even through the fog. Bela Lugosi. Dracula's hypnotic gaze concealed true pain. He made the world tremble with a stare, but behind those iconic eyes was a man fighting to stand, to speak, and sometimes just to see. Bela Lugosi's portrayal of Dracula in 1931 didn't just define horror, it defined him. The stiff posture, the deliberate walk, the slow, penetrating gaze. Audiences thought it was all performance. In truth, it was survival. Lugosi had endured brutal injuries during World War I. Shrapnel left him with permanent damage to his lower back and legs. By the time he arrived in Hollywood, the pain was a constant companion, sharp, electric, and unforgiving. He walked with a subtle limp, often stiff-legged, because bending at the waist sent shocks through his spine. But when the cameras rolled, he turned the disability into mystique. Dracula didn't walk like other men, because Lugosi physically couldn't. His iconic stare, it came from something else entirely. Severe nearsightedness. Without his thick prescription glasses, which he couldn't wear on camera, Lugosi could barely see more than a few feet ahead. Every hypnotic glance was actually a man straining to focus on something he couldn't quite make out. It added to the otherworldly effect. The studio ate it up. But off-screen, it was chaos. He frequently walked into set pieces and tripped over cables. Crew members whispered that he was off or clumsy. What they didn't realize was that he was navigating every stage as if through fog, with pain pulsing down his spine. And as the injuries worsened, so did his need for relief. He reportedly leaned on heavy medication to keep functioning, not for pleasure, but just to get through the day. His hands would grip furniture between takes, his face pale as he waited for the next cue. Assistants rushed to his side the moment the director yelled, "Cut!" helping him back to a chair before he collapsed. Universal Studios, instead of offering support, leaned harder into his suffering. His pain gave Dracula an eerie stiffness. His speech delays, caused by a wartime brain injury, were misread as slow-burning menace. They let the myth grow while the man beneath it faded. Lugosi didn't just play a monster. He carried one inside him. And long after the applause faded, he was left with nothing but the ache, the shadow, and the silence of a system that only loved him when he was in character. Katharine Hepburn. Her shaking voice was her survival. They called her eccentric. In truth, she was trembling. Katharine Hepburn wasn't just an actress, she was an institution. Fiercely independent, defiantly outspoken, and unmistakably elegant, she carved a path through Hollywood on her own terms. But even legends have to hide things, and for Hepburn, the secret wasn't in her past. It was in her nervous system. By her early 30s, she had developed what's known as an essential tremor, a progressive neurological condition that caused her head and hands to shake involuntarily. But in an era that prized poise and stillness, there was no room for visible fragility. MGM executives whispered that she was nervous, unstable, or overdramatic. No one dared say the truth out loud. And so, Hepburn adapted, with style. She pioneered a rapid, clipped way of speaking that masked her head tremors, turning a medical symptom into a signature cadence. Her fashion followed suit. High-necked blouses, silk scarves, and pockets stitched into every costume to hide shaking hands. Everything that became iconic, the mannerisms, the wardrobe, the voice, had purpose. Behind the scenes, directors like George Cukor learned to shoot around her condition. Longer takes, smoother pans. Blocking that allowed her to remain in motion, so the tremors faded into the background. She was never still, because stillness revealed too much, but the strain took its toll. She declined public dinners and turned down social invitations, afraid the shaking might betray her. Some thought she was cold or aloof. In reality, she was strategic, fiercely protecting her image, even as the tremor slowly worsened. The most brutal irony. When she fought for better roles or accommodations, studio heads used her condition as quiet leverage, threatening to expose what she was working so hard to hide. Eventually, she stepped away for nearly 5 years. Not because her talent faded, but because the mask was growing heavier. And yet, when she returned, she did so with grace and command, winning 4 Academy Awards across her career. A record still unmatched. Katharine Hepburn didn't just survive Hollywood, she outsmarted it, and the very things she was forced to conceal became the hallmarks of her legend. What others called a flaw, she turned into a signature. Lionel Barrymore, the wheelchair they couldn't hide anymore. He once stood beside the greats. Then, without fanfare, he disappeared behind a desk and stayed there. Lionel Barrymore came from a dynasty of performers. On stage and screen, he was commanding, dignified, impossible to ignore. But by the early 1930s, something began to change. Audiences noticed he no longer stood during scenes. Directors blocked him behind pianos, lecterns, or high-backed chairs. What they didn't know was that he was slowly being crushed by pain. Barrymore suffered from severe arthritis that twisted his joints and made every movement feel like bone grinding against bone. But that wasn't all. A fractured hip, improperly treated, left him unable to walk unaided. To the studio, it wasn't a health crisis. It was an inconvenience. At first, MGM forced him into metal braces, hidden beneath his wardrobe. They were torturous devices, designed not to heal, but to conceal. He'd endure hours of filming, standing with false strength, only to collapse into his dressing room afterward, his undergarments soaked in blood from where the braces bit into his skin. Still, he didn't complain, because in those days to complain was to be replaced. Eventually, the pain became too great. The braces came off. The wheelchair rolled in, and with it came a compromise. MGM would allow Barrymore to continue working, but only if the wheelchair could be written into the role or disguised entirely. Suddenly, all his characters sat. Judges, bankers, villains, always seated, always still. The most iconic of these? Mr. Potter in It's a Wonderful Life. Audiences saw a heartless miser confined to a chair, not realizing the actor behind him was confined by something far more cruel, a system that only acknowledged his condition when it had no other choice. And even then, the cost was steep. His salary was slashed. Publicity releases blamed a singular injury, never the degenerative condition that made his mornings a struggle and his nights sleepless. Studios feared that labeling a star as disabled might damage the illusion of strength Hollywood clung to so tightly. Lionel Barrymore was the first major star Hollywood couldn't stand up anymore. But instead of fading, he remained seated and stole every scene. And in doing so, he quietly redefined what strength could look like on screen. Montgomery Clift, the face they rebuilt. In 1956, one of Hollywood's most beautiful men crashed into a telephone pole and emerged a ghost wearing his own skin. Montgomery Clift was more than just a heartthrob. He was a new kind of actor, quiet, brooding, soulful. He brought vulnerability to the screen at a time when leading men were supposed to be bulletproof. But everything changed one night after leaving Elizabeth Taylor's house in Beverly Hills. Driving down a winding road, Clift's car veered off course and slammed headfirst into a stone wall. The crash shattered his nose, cheekbone, and jaw. He was pulled from the wreckage, barely breathing, blood soaking into his shirt. Taylor herself reportedly reached into his mouth to clear his airway, saving his life before the ambulance arrived. But the damage was done. Surgeons worked to rebuild his face, wiring his jaw shut and reconstructing his shattered features with metal plates. They did what they could, but the symmetry was gone. His cheek drooped, his smile stiffened. His eyes, once so expressive, seemed dulled by the trauma. The studios tried to pretend nothing had changed. They framed him from the left side, used soft lighting, and leaned heavily on Taylor's support to ease him back into Raintree County. But Clift knew the truth. So did the audience. The man they remembered was still there, but slightly blurred, like a photograph someone had pressed too hard against glass. And what the camera couldn't see, the mirror couldn't hide. The physical pain never left him. Eating became difficult. Smiling was exhausting. He began to retreat inward, haunted by the loss of the face that had once made him a star. Some said he became erratic. Others said he simply couldn't stay sober. Whatever the cause, his decline was sharp, and the studios, once enchanted, kept their distance. He lived for another decade, but never fully returned to the peak he once held. Directors like John Huston and Elia Kazan still respected his genius, but he was no longer Hollywood's golden boy. Montgomery Clift's face was rebuilt, but his spirit never truly recovered. And in that quiet unraveling, he became something even rarer than a matinee idol, a tragic symbol of what it costs to wear beauty like armor, only to have it cracked open by fate. Peter Lorre, deformed feet, and studio mistrust. He became Hollywood's go-to villain, not because of what he did, but because of how he looked when he entered a room. Peter Lorre's haunting eyes, high-pitched voice, and twitchy intensity made him unforgettable in classics like M and the Maltese Falcon. But the nervous energy he projected on screen wasn't just a performance. It was the product of a body shaped by pain and a system that refused to see past it. Lorre was born with severely misshapen feet. Some sources describe them as congenitally deformed. Others claim early illness or injury altered his gait permanently. Either way, by the time he reached Hollywood, he walked with a slight drag, his feet turned in at odd angles. Studios didn't offer medical help. They simply used it. Directors cast him as creeps, criminals, and cowards. He was never the romantic lead, never the hero, always the shadow in the corner, the hunched man behind the curtain. Costumers designed shoes to disguise the deformity, but the limp remained, and so did the stigma. Worse still, his accent and unusual appearance made him the target of studio politics. Warner Brothers used Lorre relentlessly, but never trusted him. He was passed over for major roles, underpaid despite box office success, and often manipulated with false promises. His attempts to break free, to direct, to write, to control his own image were quietly sabotaged. The weight of it wore him down. By the 1950s, Lorre was allegedly struggling to stay sober. He spoke openly of exhaustion, of feeling like he was trapped in a body and an industry that never allowed him to evolve. He kept working, in horror, in television, even in comedy, but the sparkle dimmed. His body aged faster than his years. And still, he gave everything to the camera. Because behind every sinister character he played, there was a man trying to prove he was more than what the studios saw in his walk. Peter Lorre didn't ask to be typecast. He was born into it. And while his villains terrified generations, the real tragedy was how Hollywood turned physical difference into a lifetime sentence. All he ever wanted was a role with dignity. Mary Astor, Hidden Stroke, Hollow Eyes. She won an Oscar with poise and elegance, but her final years were spent in silence, with a voice that trembled and eyes that seemed to stare past the present. Mary Astor was the epitome of class in the Golden Age, best known for her role as the elusive femme fatale in The Maltese Falcon. Her beauty was striking, but it was her intelligence and control on screen that made her unforgettable. Yet behind the sharp dialogue and precise performances was a woman who spent decades quietly battling breakdowns, betrayals, and, eventually, her own body. Her earlier years were filled with scandal, a brutal custody trial, public accusations about her personal life, and the release of private diary entries that nearly ended her career. But Astor survived the gossip mill. She kept acting, adapted to changing times, and even reinvented herself as a respected character actress in the 1950s. But age and stress eventually took their toll. In the 1960s, Astor suffered a stroke that altered her speech and motor coordination. Her once expressive face took on a subtle slackness. Her voice, once velvety and crisp, now shook unpredictably. Public appearances became rare. She retreated from the spotlight, retreating also from the woman the world remembered. She had already fought off alleged bouts of depression earlier in life. But now, with physical limitations layered on top of emotional wounds, she slipped into a kind of quiet invisibility. She spent her final years in a modest retirement home for actors, a far cry from the glamour and gowns of her heyday. Visitors who saw her in those final months often remarked on her eyes, how they still carried a glint of awareness, but rarely met anyone's for long, as if she were seeing something else, or remembering a version of herself that no longer fit. And yet, she never asked for pity. Astor wrote in her later memoirs that she believed in facing things as they come, the good and the awful. It was a final gesture of dignity from a woman who'd been used, exposed, praised, and discarded, often in the same breath. Mary Astor's greatest performance wasn't in front of the camera. It was the grace with which she vanished behind it. Not bitter, not broken, just quietly fading from a world that had long forgotten what she carried. Susan Peters, the paralyzed star who refused to quit in 1942. She was MGM's rising jewel. By 1945, she was learning how to live without the use of her legs. Susan Peters was poised to be the next big thing. With her striking presence and emotional depth, she earned an Oscar nomination for Random Harvest and seemed destined for lasting stardom. She was young, radiant, and respected. The kind of actress who could make silence speak louder than a monologue. Then, in a single heartbeat, everything changed. On a hunting trip with her husband in January 1945, a rifle accidentally discharged. The bullet struck her spine. She collapsed instantly. Paralyzed from the waist down, Hollywood froze. And like so many others who no longer fit the industry's image of perfection, she was quietly set aside. But Susan Peters didn't disappear. Instead, she rolled back into the spotlight. In a wheelchair, she signed on for the lead in The Sign of the Ram, 1948, playing a woman confined to a chair, much like herself. It was groundbreaking, not just for its time, but for its honesty. There was no illusion, no camera trickery, just raw, vulnerable performance from a woman whose life had been split into two halves, before and after the chair. But while critics admired her courage, the industry didn't know what to do with her. Roles dried up. Producers hesitated. Studios feared that audiences wouldn't accept a leading lady who couldn't walk. Peters, once the promise of tomorrow, was suddenly treated like yesterday's gamble. The offers stopped. The calls stopped. Even her marriage crumbled under the weight of it all. Behind closed doors, she reportedly battled deep despair, not just over the injury, but the betrayal. She had shown resilience, grace, even brilliance in her new circumstances. And still, it wasn't enough. In her final years, friends described a woman both brave and exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones when even your fiercest fight still leaves you unseen. She passed away at just 31. Susan Peters may have lost the use of her legs, but it was Hollywood's short-sightedness that truly failed her. And in the end, her legacy isn't the silence of her final roles. It's the thunderous strength she showed when the spotlight moved on, and she refused to. Frances Farmer, lobotomy rumors and studio gaslighting. She was bold, beautiful, and too honest for her own good. And for that, Hollywood broke her. Frances Farmer didn't play the Hollywood game. She challenged authority, questioned studio contracts, and refused to smile when she didn't feel like it. In the 1930s, that kind of independence wasn't just frowned upon, it was punished. She arrived in Hollywood with critical acclaim and a storm of curiosity. Her work in Come and Get It and Rhythm on the Range turned heads, but it was her sharp mind and refusal to be molded that made her a target. Executives branded her as difficult. Journalists wrote of her as ungrateful. In truth, she was simply trying to stay human in a machine that demanded silence. Then the whispers began. She reportedly began showing signs of alleged depression, battling mood swings and erratic behavior. But instead of support, the studio system responded with suppression. Her contract was suspended, her roles vanished, and soon, so did her freedom. She was committed to a series of mental institutions, some of which are now infamous for their inhumane treatment. At the time, little was known about what happened behind those locked doors. Decades later, former patients and staff would describe scenes of overmedication, forced confinement, and silence. The most haunting rumor? That she was subjected to a lobotomy, a procedure that, if true, would have permanently dulled the mind that once dazzled stage and screen. While definitive proof has never surfaced, the very existence of that rumor, and how long it was believed, says everything about the trauma tied to her name. When she was finally released, she was a shadow of the woman she once was. She tried to return, working in television, even hosting a small talk show, but the spark was dimmer. Not gone, but flickering. In interviews, she often spoke in cryptic fragments. "I have been miscast," she once said. "Not in movies, but in life." Frances Farmer wasn't destroyed by madness. She was dismantled by a system that called any woman with a voice unstable. And long before her mind was ever in question, her spirit was already being erased. One lie, one headline, one locked door at a time. John Garfield, hidden heart condition that silenced a giant. He played rebels, boxers, and blue-collar heroes, but the real fight was happening just beneath his ribcage. John Garfield was Hollywood's original anti-hero. Gritty, electric, and raw, he brought a streetwise authenticity to roles that made him a standout in films like Body and Soul and The Postman Always Rings Twice. But what the audience didn't see was that Garfield's pulse was ticking faster than it should have, always one beat away from collapse. He had suffered from rheumatic fever as a child, a condition that left his heart permanently weakened. Doctors warned him early in his career, avoid stress, avoid overexertion, avoid anything that would strain the delicate rhythm holding him together. But Garfield only knew one speed, all in. He pushed himself mercilessly. Long shooting days, late nights at rehearsals, passionate political speeches, and public appearances where he never let the weariness show. What he couldn't burn through with energy, he buried beneath charisma. But by the late 1940s, the pressure had changed. The House Un-American Activities Committee began its sweep of Hollywood, and Garfield, who had openly supported liberal causes, found himself under scrutiny. He refused to name names. He wouldn't betray friends. The studios, once proud to headline his name, turned cold. His career stalled. Offers vanished. Stress mounted. Behind the scenes, he was reportedly battling deep fatigue. Those closest to him said he would sometimes grip his chest, lean into a wall, and whisper that it felt like something was squeezing from the inside. He never made it public. Never wanted pity. He was too proud for that. On May 21, 1952, John Garfield died of a heart attack. He was just 39 years old, found alone in a friend's apartment, exhausted, in the city that once couldn't get enough of him. The studio system didn't issue tributes. There were no lavish retrospectives, just a quiet funeral and a long, slow erasure. One of the first stars blacklisted without ever being convicted of anything. John Garfield died with his fists still clenched, not from a scandal, not from disgrace, but from the quiet war between integrity and pressure, between a failing heart and a world that expected more from him than his body could give. Hattie McDaniel, the pioneer who died in pain and poverty. She made history with an Oscar in her hand and died unable to afford a headstone. In 1940, Hattie McDaniel stood on the stage of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, accepting the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for her role as Mammy in Gone with the Wind. She was the first black performer to win an Oscar, a trailblazer in a room that barely wanted her there. She wasn't allowed to sit at the same table as her co-stars. She entered through the kitchen. Still, she smiled. Hollywood called her a pioneer, but it never let her be anything else. Typecast in over 70 made roles, McDaniel was rarely given the chance to stretch her talent. When she fought for more complex characters, studios told her she should be grateful to be working at all. And when she spoke out, she was accused of being too loud, too demanding, too proud. But Hattie knew what was at stake. She once said, "I'd rather play a maid and make $700 a week than be one for $7. That wasn't surrender. It was survival, because off-screen, the weight of her barrier-breaking legacy came with a steep cost. As roles dried up, she turned to radio, then to rent checks. She was quietly blacklisted during the Red Scare and publicly criticized by civil rights groups for the very roles that made her famous. It seemed no one, not white Hollywood, not black America, could fully embrace the complexity of her position. She died in 1952 from breast cancer. By then, most of her fortune was gone, eaten by medical bills, bad contracts, and years of being shut out from major work. She had requested to be buried at Hollywood Forever Cemetery, but the owners refused. Because of her race, she was laid to rest elsewhere. No grand marker, no glittering tribute. Only decades later did fans and advocates fund a memorial in her honor. Too late for her to see, but not too late to matter. Hattie McDaniel shattered a ceiling that no one helped her down from. She opened a door for others, even as it closed behind her. And though Hollywood celebrated her just once, her legacy has never stopped echoing. They gave everything to be remembered, only to be forgotten for what made them human. But now, the curtain lifts again, and this time we see them whole. If these stories moved you, don't let them vanish again. Like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to help keep their legacies alive. One memory, one voice, one name at a time.